This training will talk about how to create a volunteer handbook for your nonprofit organization. Now, volunteer handbook serves three major purposes. First, it relays crucial information about your organization. Secondly, it establishes clear expectations of your volunteers. And thirdly, it emphasizes the importance of volunteers to your organization. By providing this information for your volunteers, it both welcomes them to your organization and ensures that they are given the necessary tools and resources to perform their volunteer roles well. Now, high-performing nonprofit organizations actually take advantage of the talents and time available from the volunteers, even those organizations that are fortunate enough to have a significant amount of staff and other resources. After all, the organization belongs to the members and not the staff. Many volunteers actually appreciate having a volunteer handbook that explains their role, how their contributions relate to the organization's key objectives, and "how do I" answers. Step 1. What do your volunteers want and need? The first step in developing a high-quality volunteer handbook is to find out through research what type and detail of information your volunteers want and need to know. Now listen, these can be two different questions. Volunteers may not know that what they need is separate from what they want. Research involves asking a representative sample of volunteers about their informational needs from your organization. Now this can be done via focus groups, questionnaires or e-surveys, telephone interviews, or a combination of any of these options. Your research population should also include members who are not volunteers, as they may help you uncover performance barriers that can be overcome in order to engage these extra volunteers. Now listen, it is best to offer choices in your research questions. Volunteers typically are not involved in organizational management, and it may not occur to them to ask for certain things, such as recruitment, retention, and reward strategies and tools, volunteer interview guidelines for committees, boards, etc., orientation, training, and evaluation tools, volunteer or staff roles and responsibilities outlines, effective meeting management training, volunteer succession planning, and even document templates for agendas, minutes, evaluations, or terms of reference. Step 2. What does the board expect from the volunteers? High-performing nonprofit organizations require that their volunteers' activities uphold their strategic plan, priorities, and objectives directly. Some policy boards expect volunteers to draft positions and policies and leave the implementation to the staff, while other organizations expect volunteers to do the work of the committees and deliver the programs. Your volunteer handbook should clarify the roles of volunteers and staff and be explicit on what requires approval beyond volunteers deciding to move forward. Step 3. Creating your volunteer handbook. Now, the following is a sample index of a volunteer handbook that you can adapt to your organization's unique culture and needs. Of course, through your research, it will give you your own list of things that your volunteers need and want to know. Section 1. ABC Organization and our volunteers. Here you can set the stage by describing the value of your organization and what it places on the volunteers. You can describe the history of volunteerism in your organization, what your volunteers have experienced, and these can be done through testimonies, what is expected from your volunteers, and current issues of concern to your membership. Now, you may even choose to address the barrier that most organizations face, and that's lack of time. By stating up front that you invite volunteers to contribute as much or as little time as they can commit, you create a safe place for volunteers with a limited amount of time to contribute. Section 2, Planning Responsibilities. Here, you can introduce your strategic plan and budget and explain how each volunteer unit is required to serve the plan's vision, mission, and objectives. Now, you can also present templates for preparing agendas, minutes, critical paths, etc., and explain branding requirements if this is part of your culture. High-performance organizations establish time frames for how often committees should meet, how far in advance agendas and meeting materials should go out, and how soon after a meeting to draft minutes should be distributed. This information should be included in your volunteer handbook. Section 3, Training Volunteers. High-performance organizations conduct in-person orientation sessions for new volunteers and their new volunteer teams. This information covered at orientation should be summarized in your volunteer handbook as well. An important element is to familiarize your volunteers with the key strategic objectives of your organizations so that they appreciate the context in which they fit into the bigger picture. It is recommended that your strategic plan be available to all volunteers and its location on your website noted in your volunteer handbook. Section 4, Working as a Team. It is helpful to provide an organizational chart in your volunteer handbook that establishes reporting responsibilities and clearly delineates the roles of staff and volunteers so that volunteers really understand what to expect from staff and what is appropriate to communicate with staff. It is also helpful to include contact information in your volunteer handbook of people in your organization who volunteers can turn to. For example, the board contacts, committee chairs, staff, etc. Section 5, Succession Planning for Volunteers. Many volunteers want to understand their promotion options and the qualifications that are required for different volunteer positions. By making terms of reference of all volunteer units, this could be committees, task forces, board, etc., available in your volunteer handbook, volunteers can plan their own aspirations. It is also practical to provide a reference to how long a volunteer can serve in a specific volunteer unit. If your organization has volunteer recognition and either service award programs, these should also be explained in your volunteer handbook. Section 6, Appendices. You should present the templates your organization uses for agenda, minutes, reports, etc., as well as your branding guidelines. Remember again, if this is part of your culture. You should provide your bylaws, strategic plan, terms of reference, and other key documents as well. You should also include details about insurance and liability, if that's the case, expense reports, if that's also the case, and policies and procedures that volunteers are required to follow. These should be referenced in the main body of your volunteer handbook. Keeping your volunteer handbook current. As with all key documents, your volunteer handbook should be evaluated and revised on a regular basis, minimally annually. Key documents should also be easy to access, and your volunteer handbook should be available on your website, in addition to being provided in hard copy to your volunteers. So what's next? If you need help creating your organization's volunteer handbook, please email Tanya at altruisticallyyours.com.